Yesterday, in my view, one of the darkest days in the history of our nation. An unprecedented assault on our democracy. An assault literally on the citadel of liberty.
We are in a very difficult place in our country as long as Donald Trump still sits in the White House.
Calls to remove the president from power as key administration officials resign.
I can't do it. I can't stay. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more of my friends resign over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours.
The work now begins to charge those who storm the Capitol. We still have a significant amount of work ahead of us to identify and hold each and every one of the violent mob accountable for their actions.
One thing is clear: the United States remains divided.
News 8 at 5 starts now.
The aftermath of a chaotic day in our nation's capital. The Capitol building now fenced in after the siege that left lawmakers fearing for their lives.
That fear has turned into a call to action. Invoke the 25th Amendment or Congress may attempt impeachment again. Nancy Pelosi joined others in making that plea to President Trump's cabinet. The 25th Amendment allows Vice President Mike Pence and a majority of the cabinet to declare the president unfit for office. Pence would then become acting president.
Officials within the Trump administration are removing themselves. First, Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao resigned today. So did Mick Mulvaney. He's the U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland and former acting chief of staff, both troubled by the riots.
The acting U.S. Attorney General says some of those rioters will be charged tonight. About an hour ago, the U.S. Attorney for D.C. said all charging options are on the table, including sedition. The riots left 4 people dead, many others hurt. Officials are now criticizing how police responded to the angry mob.
And we have team coverage once again tonight. We begin with Whitney Wild in Washington, D.C. on how the rioters got so deep into the Capitol building.
Why were they overwhelmed? Everyone knew this was going to happen.
Scenes from Washington shocking the world Wednesday. Extremists trashing the offices of elected officials, storming the House floor and breaking windows, blatantly walking past Capitol Police while carrying state property. It was the first time in more than 200 years that the U.S. legislature has come under attack. Americans wondering today how it could happen. Dozens have been arrested so far.
We still have a significant amount of work ahead of us to identify and hold each and every one of the violent mob accountable.
The entire D.C. National Guard was eventually mobilized to help. But according to a source familiar with the situation, it was Vice President Mike Pence, not President Trump, who helped make it happen. The lingering question, when officials knew thousands of protesters planned to march in Washington, why weren't more security measures put in place ahead of time?
It's clear to me that the police were outnumbered, and they apparently underestimated the strength and level of violence in that crowd and overestimated their ability to control the crowd.
In Washington, I'm Whitney Wild.
And the calls for impeachment or the use of the 25th Amendment on President Trump appear to be growing in Congress, and not just among Democrats. Earlier this afternoon, I talked with Indiana 8th District Congressman Larry Bucshon to see where he stands. Senator Schumer wants the president removed from office. Your colleague, Representative Kinzinger from Illinois, wants the 25th invoked. What say you?
Well, I don't know if it needs to go that far. I mean, we only have 2 weeks left in this presidency. I think that I'm not very pleased with the president for his criticism of my friend, the Vice President Mike Pence, who I think has done a tremendous job on behalf of the administration. I do think that the president needs to watch his rhetoric for the rest of his term. And today he started that by saying that he would ensure a peaceful transition of power, which is the American way.
You talked about the president's reaction over this. Do you think that he should be allowed to serve out the remaining 14 days of his presidency?
Well, I certainly, he did come out and tell people to go home. And I do believe that I hope that he continues to encourage people to stand down and to go home. We must bring the country together. We must move forward as a country in this very, very difficult election that has had, considerable issues. But we must move forward, and the electors have spoken. And then we must have a peaceful transition of power.
And that was former 5th District Congresswoman Susan Brooks talking with Brooke last night. As you heard, both are asking for a peaceful transition of power.
No one can tell me that if had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very, very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol. We all know that's true. And it is unacceptable, totally unacceptable.
With all eyes on the Capitol, many took notice of how some protesters were treated. You just heard President-elect Joe Biden weigh in. Social media is asking the same. Had the crowd been predominantly black, would there have been a bigger law enforcement response? News 8's Katira Winfrey joins us with that story.
Well, Brooke, as you know, protests are something we've grown accustomed to seeing in the last year in Indianapolis and around the country, much of them centered around racial injustice and inequities. Now, local community members say what we saw at the Capitol is evidence of the unfair treatment Black and brown people have been talking about for generations. Protesters converged on the home of American government. They stormed the Capitol by the dozens. Even with lawmakers hunkered down for safety and police around, many roamed freely.
This summer, when we had protests around Black Lives Matter, how law enforcement treated those from the Black community. When major events like this happen, Reverend Charles Harrison with Indy's 10-Point Coalition says it's easy to find the similarities, but the differences also stand out, particularly as it relates to police action or inaction. All of us was stunned and shocked by what we saw yesterday, but when you started watching how people were being treated, you could not help but to make the comparison. In Indianapolis, some of the peaceful protests calling for racial justice were answered with massive police presence. A different view as the city saw protests about the mask mandate at the State House and protests outside the governor's mansion for the stay-at-home order.
During the protests this summer, when we stood up and we protested peacefully, we had law enforcement in clothes on us, and they started shooting paintballs, mace, and everything else at us, and we weren't even breaking anything. They was coming in on us. Yet and still, you got law enforcement open up the doors for a different culture. James Wilson, CEO of Circle Up Indy, participated in some of the protests this summer and watched as groups never even reached the State House steps because they were met well before then by armed law enforcement. What they did was expose the hand of what still exists in our country, that cultural and racial division and divide. And I have a question and a poll up right now on my Facebook and Twitter pages if you'd like to chime in. Reporting in the studio, I'm Wish TV News 8's multicultural reporter, Katira Winfrey.